What's going on, guys? Jonathan Shane here, functional nutritional therapy practitioner specializing in low carb endurance and performance. If you haven't subscribed to the channel and you want to be updated on how to optimize and dial in your fitness and your health while utilizing a low carb diet, this is the channel. Hit the subscribe button and like this video. Today we're going to be talking about when carbs can be important for ketogenic athletes. Now, this is a nuanced conversation, and you're going to have people that don't have experience with certain sports that will debate this by and far, neck and neck, all that stuff. So I want to get into the nuance of it because, again, it's, even I make Instagram posts that are very steak is the king of endurance running. I totally believe that. But I will also talk about carbohydrates. Y'all know me. I'm blunt. I'm unbiased. I look at the literature, and I understand things from a 20,000 foot view. And so understanding when carbs can be essential for athletes is super, super important. We kind of talked about this in the last video, but I want to get a little bit nuanced in terms of how to practically apply this for you. Okay, so consider this a free coaching session. If you want to dial in it even more as you hear what I'm saying, I have free consultations to figure out where you're at, what you need, and how I can help. You can click that link in the comments section and we can dive into that. So just keep that in mind as you listen. Okay, so as far as carbs with ketogenic athletes, obviously keto and carbs are not necessarily synonymous, right? Why? Because ketones are the base of our fuel. Fat creates way more ATP. Ketogenic diet's better on insulin sensitivity, it's better on inflammation, it's better on muscle recovery and anti-catabolic environment, meaning when ketones are present, your body is not as apt to go after breaking down muscle to create glucose because it can use the ATP from the fat as well as it can create glucose from the backbone glycerol molecule of the fatty acids that you're using, okay? But that does not mean that carbs are a bad macronutrient. I will argue this. Carbs as a macronutrient are not bad, okay? There are foods in that conversation that are bad. Refined, bleached carbohydrates, right? Chemically infused carbohydrates. Hyperpalatable foods that also have bad fats and adulterated fats, right? So fats can be bad, carbs can be bad. Really, the only macronutrient that can't necessarily be bad is protein. You can argue incomplete protein isn't as efficient as complete proteins, but protein itself is probably the only macronutrient that doesn't have a good and a bad. It's just good, right? Which is why everybody loves protein. But my point is that you can have bad fats. We all know that. You can also have bad carbs, but there are good carbs. There are good carbs that can be beneficial for you at the right times if you need them, okay? So let's break this up into 3 sections. We'll break this up into weightlifting. Then we'll talk about intense interval training, and then we'll talk about running, okay? And then running has its own conversation. I'll try to make this not too long. So, when we're talking about weightlifting, okay? And again, I've talked about this in other videos, but I just feel like for this video, it's prudent for application. You don't necessarily need carbohydrates for muscle building. Plenty of people on low-carb ketogenic diets not only build muscle, they build adequate muscle. Enough muscle to compete professionally in bodybuilding shows and powerlifting competitions on a carnivore diet. Not even keto, but carnivore. Now, yes, I know keto and carnivore are not necessarily synonymous, but when we're talking about using fat as fuel, they are in this conversation because ketogenic diets and carnivorous diets both use fat as your primary fuel source, okay? And so in this conversation, carnivore and ketogenic athletes both can build adequate muscle absent of carbohydrates, okay? You really don't need them to perform muscle-bearing exercises, right? You have enough glycogen, and if you give yourself enough rest between training sessions, you can replenish that glycogen. We know that from the FASTER study. We know that from anecdotal evidence and observation, and obviously I know that anecdotally from me as well. And so you don't necessarily need carbohydrates to build muscle. Now, when can carbohydrates be good for someone that's just in the gym? The biggest argument for this is women. Okay, men really and truly, if we look at the clinical data, men do not need carbohydrates to build muscle. Now, optimally, that's going to be argued, right? I'm not going to sit there and get in the hairs of that because, 2 people can argue that back and forth all day. What I will say is this. As a man, you do not need carbohydrates to build muscle in the gym. You just don't, right? You don't. You can argue it makes you feel better. You can argue that you just don't want to let go of carbohydrates. You enjoy having them in your diet, which is fine, but you don't need them. They're not a necessity, right? You can build plenty of muscle on a ketogenic, ketovore, I guess that's technically a term too, carnivorous diet, okay? You need protein, you need fat. There's plenty of people on here that have been carnivore or ketogenic for years, and they build muscle just fine, right? Not a big deal. When it comes to women, from a physiological standpoint, when we're looking at mTOR, protein synthesis, and muscle building, you also do not need carbohydrates. Now we have to get in the conversation physiologically of hormones, cortisol, sex hormone balance, and overall output of energy and performance. Women tend to benefit more from carbohydrates, specifically during different times of their cycles on a ketogenic carnivorous diet. Cycling in carbs during your luteal phase, ovulation phase. Some women are early on into their menstrual phase. This can be beneficial for giving you that little bit more of an umph, replenishing glycogen quicker, not letting your body take the brunt from a cortisol response, and overall creating a better, better managed hormone balance. Okay. Now there are plenty of women that are carnivore that build muscle in the gym. All right. So I'm not saying that all of them. I'm saying that a lot of them would do better with some form of whole food carbohydrate. And at the end of this video, I'll talk about different forms of carbohydrates and if they're good or not, in my opinion on them. So that would be a situation, right? Again, I'm just being honest. This is unbiased. This is just, telling you how it is. Some women can benefit, and a lot more than you would think, are sluggish in the gym, and they think it's because they haven't been fat adapted long enough, even though they've been doing keto for 6, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months to a year. Some can benefit from some carbohydrates pre or post workout for recovery or for a little bit more energy to go in there and kick it and get after it, okay? So that's muscle building, all right? Now let's talk about interval training, right? So we're talking CrossFit. We're talking high rocks training. We're talking Spartan training. Like, where you're doing a little bit of running, you're doing some weightlifting, but that weightlifting is not always like, 90-second, 2-minute rest between sets. You're not really focused on necessarily hypertrophy. You're focused on intensity, right? Which obviously builds muscle and stuff, but it's just different, right? We all know that. Interval training is different, okay? In this scenario, again, you can argue that men do not need carbohydrates in order to complete a CrossFit workout. Now, it can be argued that if you're doing CrossFit 6 days a week at a very high intensity, you're not really taking like rest, you're not really like going through the motions, right? You're just going in there and going after it, and that's just what you like to do. I would obviously encourage more rest days, which is going to help you need less carbohydrates. But if you're someone that just, you're competing for something, you're training for something, or that's just how you like to do it, that's how you do your thing, you can benefit from some carbohydrates. Why? Because even though we can replenish glycogen, there still is some glycogen replenishment processes that could benefit from being done faster by just giving yourself some carbohydrates post-workout or even in the middle of a workout so your body's not fully tapping into glycogen, okay? For example, if we look at the FASTER study, which I brought up many times, I'll cite it below. When we look at it, the average carbohydrate intake from these low-carb athletes was 70 grams a day. That means some of these guys were doing 50 grams of carbs a day, and some of these guys were doing 100 and plus grams carbs a day. These guys were not zero carb. There is no study that's been done on carnivorous athletes fully replenishing glycogen in high-intensity, high-endurance interval training. And again, that's not me bashing carnivore. There are plenty of athletes that are beasts, that are strict carnivores. I'm simply speaking from a literature standpoint. I'm speaking like from what I've seen as a coach, what I've worked with. If you're doing high intensity interval training 6 days a week, a lot, you're competing for something, your training is super intense, you can benefit from some carbohydrates on a ketogenic diet from a hormone standpoint, from a glycogen replenishment standpoint. And again, we'll get into the nuance of that here with the carbohydrate foods in just a moment. And then we get into women. I would put the more intense the training, the more women really need to consider cycling in some carbs strategically at the right times. Because again, y'all have a much stronger cortisol response to these things, especially at different phases of your cycle. And it's something to really take note of, that if you are in the gym and you're feeling bad, you haven't been sick in a while, you've been strict keto, strict carnivore for a while, and you don't understand why everything's getting messed up, you're starting to miss your cycles, all this stuff, it's not a bad idea to consider adding in some carbohydrates, 30, 40 grams pre or post workout. I'm not saying you need to eat carbs all day. I'm not saying that you need to go eat a Snickers bar. I'm saying adding some in. If you're someone that loves to do CrossFit 6 days a week, you're training for a High Rocks, you're training for the CrossFit Open, which is right around the corner, whatever that might be, you could benefit from some. It could be as simple as a tablespoon of honey before your workout. Like, it doesn't have to be super complicated. But again, interval training is a little different because of the hormonal physiological response that your body has to it. Okay, so that's interval training. Then we get into running. Now, running is nuanced, right? Because again, fat adaptation does create more ATP. Fatty acids create more ATP. And so if you're running at a zone 2, right? So, and this is where this gets a little nuanced. So I'm trying to explain this the best way I possibly can. So nerds, pull out your notebooks and your pens. Okay, it's going to get interesting. When you're at zone 2, there's two things we have to think about: intensity and duration. Okay? If someone's running at zone 2 for, an hour, right? You don't need carbohydrates. You just don't. You can do it fasted. It's totally fine. And your body will be able to handle it, especially if you're fat adapted. If you go through the right things, like when I take my clients through my 3 phases of the fat fueled system, right? If you go through the phases properly, you can run 6 miles without eating on a fat adapted diet in a zone 2 intensity, where your body's using mostly fat anyways. It's not even really tapping into glycogen. Okay, it is a little bit, right? Because your body's not that black and white. Like, people talk about like using ketones. Like, well, if my ketones are high, I'm not using sugar. So if my ketones are low, I'm using sugar. It's like, no, even if your ketones are high, you're still using glucose. Your body still requires 30% glucose. Like, people forget that. Even if you're on a ketogenic diet, even if your ketones are high, you're still needing glucose. And so it's just something to keep in the back of your mind for later in this conversation. Point is, though, is that if you're doing zone 2 for a moderate duration, you really don't need carbohydrates, right? So a ketogenic athlete that's lifting weights 3 or 4 times a week and then getting in, a 4-mile run 3 days a week, especially a man, probably doesn't need carbohydrates at all. They could probably handle that just fine. They could even progress and get in better shape just fine with no carbs, feel great, all that jazz. Okay, so intensity, duration, right? So where's that change real quick? So let's say that you do a zone 2 for 4 hours, right? Let's say you're training for an ultra. Now we're having a different conversation because that little tap into glycogen is starting to grow, okay? It doesn't matter how fat adapted you are. Once you deplete in about 40% glycogen stores, your body starts to fight you. It's just physiology, right? It's just physics, or physiology rather. So understanding that is important, because once you get like that 60% glycogen threshold, you really, so you've taken 40% away or so, you really do start to struggle, okay? And so in that situation, a ketogenic carnivorous endurance runner would benefit from some carbohydrates during those long duration runs. So we're talking, again, like 4 hours, and we're talking like 30 grams of carbs an hour. You could take a little pack of like raw, unfiltered, non-GMO organic honey, and you could have like 1 or 2 of those an hour during your long run, and you're going to be okay. That's enough. You don't have to go crazy. And again, for a ketogenic athlete, they might hear that and go, well, that's 120 grams of carbs during a run. You got to figure though, a high carb athlete is doing like 400 grams of carbs during a 4-hour run. So it's important to understand the nuance when we're comparing the two, right? Because low carb ketogenic running is just a different animal, and not because it's more difficult in some ways or necessarily, but it's just the physiological response to stressful endurance, especially when it's long duration. So again, just to recap that, just bring it all back to simple terms. Zone 2 for short durations, under 90 minutes, you probably don't need any carbohydrates at all. You'll be fine. If you are doing long durations of zone 2, you're probably going to need some carbohydrates. You might get away with it once, right? Because like anybody can run, like these guys that have run 100 miles fasted, but they will tell you that you can do it, but the body's response to that is very intense, right? Because the body doesn't like to do it. Just because you can do something, which is cool because it proves a point. It proves that carbohydrates don't need to be the bolus of what you do. But my point is that there is a strong stress response to that, right? Everybody knows that. Zach Bitter, I can name a couple of really cool, really prominent endurance athletes that are fat-based, animal-based, but they will tell you, bro, carbs are not bad, right? And they really need them for those competitive moments, okay? So again, short duration, low intensity, no need for carbs. Low intensity, high duration, some need for carbs. Now let's talk about intensity getting up there. Once your intensity gets to a certain point, right? So let's say that you're, running 50 miles a week. You're doing a long run on the weekends. You're doing 2 speed workouts or hill trainings a week. This is where carbohydrates come a little bit more in handy. Okay, this is as we peak for races with my clients, they will start to get to a point where their diet will become much more low carb in nature and not necessarily ketogenic. Now you might be freaked out like, well, I want to be in ketosis. We'll talk about that in a second. So they might shoot for, instead of 30 to 40 grams an hour just during their long runs, they might have 100 grams of carbs a day. 50 of those are allocated to recovering glycogen, and the other 50 are just what they're allotted on a normal ketogenic diet anyways. Right, so they might be shooting for 100 grams of carbs Monday through Sunday at that point in their training. Again, this is intensified even more for female athletes. And now, granted, there are athletes that have qualified for Boston on a pure carnivore diet. So again, there are those nuances there. But in general, right, if we're looking at the broad stroke, if you are running a lot and you're getting injured and you're feeling lethargic all the time and you're on a strict ketogenic diet, you're drinking your electrolytes, you're drinking your water, you're getting in your protein, you're getting in your fat, and you just don't feel good during your runs, you would be surprised what, a tablespoon of honey or a couple boiled potatoes with salt, like right before or right after a run, can do for your recovery. It can do for your overall performance, okay? And then as far as intensity goes when it comes to speed runs, it really depends on the duration, right? If you're doing like a 5K, you'll be fine fasted. If you're doing like an 8-10 mile tempo, you could benefit from some simple carbohydrates at the beginning of the run. So that's kind of just like a quick run through. I wouldn't say quick, but a run through of like strength training, intensity interval training, and then endurance training and the nuances that come with that. Now, what kind of carbs are good? So again, I'll get some flack for some of these. Some of these I'll get praises. I don't really care. Again, I'm just looking at the unbiased. So really, the main focus is tubers. So if I had to go like in order, I would say tubers, fruits, and then some grains. We'll talk about that in a second. So tubers, fruits, and some grains. Why tubers before fruits? Yes, people talk about oxalates and things like that, but the truth is that if you cook them and you cook them well and they're found good sourced, cassava root, sweet potato, white potato, red potato, purple potato, all those things. If they're good sourced and you cook them right, you really diminish oxalate count, right? So I'm not worried about oxalate dumping from you eating a sweet potato, for example. I wouldn't be concerned about that at all. Those are good because they don't have a lot of fructose, which I know I don't bring up fructose for the reasons you may think, right? Like fatty liver and all that. Because if you're running that much, you're not going to be in a calorie surplus. Therefore, even if you do eat fructose, your body's going to use it because it needs it. It's not going to let it get stored as adipose tissue around your liver, okay? Remember, fructose in a calorie surplus is bad. Fructose not in a calorie surplus is not necessarily bad because your body doesn't necessarily let it accumulate. We've seen this in studies where they gave control groups one in a calorie deficit, one in a calorie surplus, but they gave them the exact same amount of fructose, which was like way over the dietary limit. What they found was the one in the group in the deficit did not get fatty liver. The one in the surplus did. So it's an important nuance, right? People don't just get fatty liver because they have one Coke a day. And I'm not saying Coke is good. We're just talking about fructose here, isolated. It's because they're drinking 10 Cokes a day, which is a ridiculous amount of calories, and it's being eaten in conjunction with chicken and waffles and a triple baconator with a large fry on the side, right? So those calories plus all that fructose plus those seed oils create metabolic dysregulation, which cause a lot of fat storage because of the high calorie surplus, which ultimately results in fatty liver. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but I'm not talking about fructose for that reason. The reason why is because fructose does have to go through the liver, right? And so it gets transferred in triglycerides. So it's not a quick glucose blood to the muscle food. It's better to focus on things like glucose, complex carbohydrates, and things like that break down into sugar in your bloodstream so that it can be used in the event that you're doing, or it can be glycogen replenishment for you. So that's why tubers and then fruit, because fruit does have some fructose. Now, not all fruits created equal. Like when we hear fruit, we hear fructose, but the reality is that like an apple is like 13% fructose, right? Like the 20 grams of carbs in an apple, like only like 4 grams of it is fructose. So it's not like you're getting a lot of fructose from a lot of fruits, but it's just the idea of like, again, tubers, fruit, and then some grains. So what grains am I okay with? I'm okay with white rice. White rice is fine. White rice, I think, is easily digestible. You don't have to deal with a lot of the anti-nutrients that are around the husk, like, say, brown or black rice. I like white rice. White rice absorbs quick. It's easy on the stomach. It's easily digestible. Obviously, I try to shoot for organic, non-GMO, pesticide, glyphosate, residual-free, things like that. The other one that I'm okay with is oatmeal. Now, that one might get me in trouble, but whatever. I have found with clients and with myself that do eat it when they need it. It's an easily digestible carbohydrate. Again, my rules on it, though, are non-GMO, glyphosate residual free, and preferably sun-dried. Like, you want these things to be as natural as possible if you're going to eat them. That's why people tend not to eat them, even if I do say they're okay, because the rules I have around them. The only brand I know that does everything that I like is called Red Tractor, which is in Australia. Like, they do it all. Glyphosate residual free, gluten free, sun dried, non-GMO, pesticide. Like, those are some good oats. But again, there's a lot of rules around it, so you don't have. I'm just saying, like, if you do find if you meet those parameters, it's okay. Like, I don't think it's gonna hurt you. And yeah, so those are kind of like the carbohydrates I'm okay with. Beans, they're just there for full. Like, I don't. They're not beneficial for running, right? They're not beneficial for running, right? And that's what we're talking about. Another cool couple simple carbohydrates again: raw unfiltered honey. 100% maple syrup is amazing. Did you know that 100% maple syrup is like 5% allulose? Like, it's a naturally occurring form of allulose, which can help with appetite suppression. It can help with GLP-1 inhibiting without you having to take Wegovy, right? So maple syrup can be a good option for pre or post run. And so yeah. So this is a long video. I'll stop here. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments and questions on this. So if you have them, put them in the comment section below. Again, I'll post that faster study. I'll post the fructose study. And then if you want to schedule a call to figure out how I can help you, I'd love to. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. I'll see y'all in the next one.